Pat Garrett, Vampire Hunter, by Cody Bogart, from a screenplay by Keith Lawson. Available as an ebook on Amazon Kindle, published by Badman Publishing of Bournemouth. His bones ached from days in the saddle, nights on hard ground. He wasn't getting any younger. Time to think about hanging up his guns, buying a place where he could sit on a porch and sip good whiskey. But first, he had a duty to perform, and that kept him going. Call it a crusade, maybe. If not him, then who? The horse had seen better days, but it was still reliable, plodding along unquestionably. On its back, a tired figure rode slowly up the dusty trail. The long dry summer had made the ground arid. Autumn had yet to bring any rain, just shorter days and longer nights. The sun began its last descent to the horizon, casting long shadows over the rugged landscape. The rider started to wonder whether he would make it to any settlement, or whether to set up camp before the light was totally gone. He was encouraged to persevere when shapes took form on the horizon. Man-made shapes, standing out against the rocks and hills of the countryside, the first sign of an interference with the natural world. As he drew near at an amble, not forcing his steed into a trot, he started to identify what he could see. A railed fence around a spacious yard, a shack to one side, a tattered awning over the other side. The breeze lifted dust devils across the dry ground. Pulling up, the man sat on his horse, the public side of notices, and inspected the layout more closely. A faded sign said, "Jericho Silver Mine." Another, also weather-worn, said, "No trespassers, keep out or get shot," but there was no indication of anyone to object to an intrusion or to shoot him. Dismounting with a practiced ease, his boots kicked up small puffs of dust as he landed. He stood for a moment, surveying the scene, his keen eyes taking in every detail. The site did not look particularly neglected, but rather as if everyone had just decided to give up and move away. Recently, too, he thought, noting he could see some items of machinery and tools about. The sort of thing that could be carried away or sold for money. Nothing that would be ignored when closing down the site. Having checked his pistol was free in its holster, he approached the mine's entrance cautiously, every sense on high alert. The likelihood of some presence, either a caretaker or maybe disturbing a looter. Or could everyone be inside the mine, something big happening? Although no sound was reaching his ears until the wooden supports groaned ominously, an adjustment to the cooling evening air, and he hesitated for a heartbeat before stepping closer. Otherwise, the mine was deathly silent, not a sound, human or animal. A hand instinctively took a grip of his revolver, the cold handle a comforting weight against his palm in case he needed to draw. When eventually satisfied there were no immediate threats lurking in the shadows, he turned his attention to the shack. The mine could wait. If there was anything to find, the shack would reveal. The structure, though small, had once been a focal point for the miners, where a foreman would have worked and instructed. The open doorway was approached with caution. Inside, a thin layer of dust having blown in through the unclosed door and broken window coated everything, from the battered table to the rusty tools that lay scattered about, an indication of abandonment. The only light came from the sun's last rays filtering through the west-facing window, casting an amber glow over the room. His eyes scanned the interior, noting the remnants of a life once lived here, a tattered blanket, an empty whiskey bottle, a faded photograph pinned to the wall. Someone's family in that stiff pose required not to blur the image, while the lens was held uncovered. Moving to the table, he found a yellowed piece of paper, which was held down by an empty mug and lay half hidden beneath the dust. He moved the mug and picked the paper up, wiping it clean with his sleeve. It was a hand-drawn map of the mine, the lines and annotations barely legible but still discernible to someone with a sharp eye, and he was fortunate he did not yet need spectacles. He traced the drawn passage with his finger, noting the marked locations, side tunnels, veins of silver, and what seemed to be a large chamber deep within. Losing the borrowed light of sunset inside the shack, it was time to fold the map and slip it into a coat pocket. He turned to leave, but not before casting one last glance around. There was something here, something that had driven everyone away, and he was curious to uncover it. His senses on high alert, and whether it linked to his mission. Outside, the cool evening air was a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. The horse, Buck, stood patiently, ears flicking at sights and sounds of the approaching night, the first stars showing. The man mounted, casting a final look at the abandoned mine. Shadows lengthened and merged into the gathering darkness, and a sense of being watched lingered. With a swift kick, he urged Buck forward. The night was closing in fast, and he didn't want to sleep in the open. And now, the likelihood of a town nearby to service the mine's needs, which might also provide answers as well as lodgings, was attractive. The ride to the town was maybe just a mile. A rising moon and the twilight rays of a sun provided enough light to see the way. He hadn't seen the town from the mine but could follow tracks, deep set from wagons carrying silver from the mine and supplies from the town to the mine. There was no doubt in his mind that he would come to a town soon. A mine needed a town to provide supplies and entertainment, and towns were drawn to mines for their money-making opportunities. Firstly, though, he came across, between the mine and town, on the outskirts of the latter, 2 garish wagons. Solid-topped, not canvas, one with lurid writing on the side. Circus of mysteries, you won't believe your eyes, and illustrations, especially of some nubile women. No one was outside the wagons, just shackled horses grazing. With the onset of night, he assumed the circus people had retired into the wagons. He continued past and half a mile along came into the small mining town. It was a modest place, its buildings huddled together as if for support. Structures that had hastily been thrown up to service the mine when it had opened, and no investment to improve since. Few were made of stone, the bank and the jail being the notable exceptions. The only buildings that dared to rise above a single story were the saloon and what was possibly a hotel, their second floors breaking the line of flatness of the rest of the buildings along the street. Buck picked up pace towards the livery stable, the first building at the edge of town positioned at the entrance and egress points of the town on the mine's side. The horse had scented the air, thick with the smell of hay and horse, despite being devoid of animals. Inside, a pale youth, no older than 14, stepped forward. He moved quietly, his eyes never quite meeting the newcomer. Take good care of him, rub him down, give him some oats. The youth was instructed by a voice firm but not unkind. The stable hand nodded, a quick, jerky motion, and waited for his customer to unsaddle and take his kit off the horse, before leading Buck into one of the stalls after. Somewhere safe I can leave these. The man indicated his saddle and bedroll, with a coffee pot and mug wrapped inside. The pale youth pointed to the back of the stable, a place that was used as an office, if only fitted out with a table and chair. The man took his stuff over and deposited it behind the table, retaining his saddlebag and a rifle. Items stored, he walked back to the youth, who was holding his horse by the reins. He took dollar bills out of his pocket. This enough? When answered with a nod, he handed it over. Where can I bunk down? The youth pointed down the street, put the money in his pocket, and secured the horse in the stall. He'd been assessed but not revealed an answer. A mute or simple? Satisfied his steed was being cared for, the man made his way towards the hotel, which was the second double-story building, his boots tapping softly against the wooden planks of the sidewalk. The hotel, even with its weathered facade and uneven steps, at least looked a bit more durable than other buildings along the street. He surmised it probably entertained management and owners visiting the mine. As the only hotel in town, the owner had apparently not seen the need to sign it, which was why the newcomer had not identified it himself. Inside the hotel, the owner, Jakeman, was behind a counter to the back and to the side of the foyer. Opposite, a set of stairs led to the upper floor. As the door opened, his hand dropped below the counter level to hover over a pistol. The newcomer stepped inside, saw an older male, late 50s maybe, small build, going bald, looking edgy. He paused, sensing tension. "I'd like a room." Not so much a polite request. The tone suggested he expected to get a room. Assertive, but tired also from his journey here. Many nights on the trail, possibly tribulations. Jakeman found his voice, but the hand was still near the gun.
"How long for?"
"Not sure. 2 nights, maybe more," he said, moving up to the counter. Jakeman relaxed at his inspection of the guest, seeing a tired, not young cowboy, but with some authority in his posture. Both hands up, away from the pistol, he spun the ledger and indicated a pen and inkwell.
"Sign in."
The rifle was rested on the counter, the pen dipped in the ink, and register signed. Jakeman spun the ledger back and read. He looked up in surprise.
"Pat Garrett, the man who shot Billy the Kid?"
He didn't say more. Garrett's look dissuaded him. The reputation of being the man who had bested the kid worked 2 ways, one in his favor, the other not. He'd once captured the outlaw, seen him sent to prison, but tracked him down after an escape and shot the killer dead. Jakeman found his voice.
"Rooms upstairs. Pick anyone. No other guests."
Garrett regained his rifle, turned, and having walked the few steps from the desk, started to climb the stairs. Jakeman called after him.
"If you're hungry, I can rustle up something to eat."
Garrett only hesitated for a second, did not turn round, and continued climbing the stairs, tiredness beating hunger. That left Jakeman looking at the signature in his ledger with some awe. Coming off the top step, Garrett paused to check along the corridor, which was dimly lit. The flickering lamps, needing wicks trimmed, cast shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. Opening the first door, he didn't like the room, mostly because it was the first accessible one, and therefore the most vulnerable if attacked. He hadn't survived this long without being cautious, just noted that it was unoccupied as the hotel owner had said. He tried the next one along, pushed the door open, and inspected before stepping inside. The room was simple but clean, with a sturdy bed, a washstand, and a small writing desk. He set his bag down, leaned his rifle against the desk, and took a moment to glance out the window. Below, the town was settling into the quiet of the evening. He turned away from the window, a frown creasing his brow. The sense of foreboding he felt at the mine had not left him. There was something about this place, something that gnawed at the edges of his intuition. The street had no activity and no lights and windows for the most part. The stillness of the hotel lobby was shattered as Jakeman, the second he heard the door to a bedroom close, bolted from behind the reception desk, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Pat Garrett, the infamous lawman who had gunned down Billy the Kid, was staying at his establishment. The hotel owner's mind raced as he hurried down the moonlit street towards Mayor Anderson's residence. He rapped on the mayor's door with urgency, the sound disturbing the quiet night. After a moment, the door swung open, revealing Mayor Anderson, his face creased with irritation at the unexpected intrusion.
What is it, Jakeman?
The mayor growled, disturbed from a session with a whiskey bottle and his accounts.
Mayor, you won't believe who just booked into my hotel.
Jakeman said, barely able to contain his excitement. He didn't wait for an answer.
Pat Garrett, the man who killed Billy the Kid.
The irritation on Anderson's face melted into a look of surprise, then contemplation. He stepped back, allowing Jakeman to enter, and closed the door.
Garrett? Here? In our town? This could be significant.
Indeed.
Jakeman agreed. He lowered his voice conspiratorially.
What do you reckon he's here for?
The mayor stroked his chin thoughtfully.
Let's not jump to conclusions. He may just be passing through. Or he could be the answer to our prayers.
Jakeman nodded, a sense of unease settling over him. He knew the reputation that preceded Garrett, and it wasn't just of a lawman, it was of a man who dealt in death, swift and sure. Would his presence be for the good of the town or not? Meanwhile, in the hotel, Pat Garrett lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. Despite his calm demeanor, his mind was a whirlpool of thoughts. The map he had found at the old silver mine was tucked safely in his coat pocket, its cryptic markings awaiting his attention. He fancied that the town held secrets connected to that map, and he was determined to uncover them. From nowhere, the sound of muffled footsteps outside his room pulled him from his thoughts. He tensed, his hand moving towards the revolver on the bedside table. The footsteps paused, and then continued down the hallway. Relaxing slightly, Garrett let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The night deepened, and the town settled into an uneasy silence. Garrett knew that his presence would not go unnoticed, and that the eyes of the townfolk would be upon him. But he welcomed it. He had a purpose, a mission, and no amount of curiosity or suspicion would deter him. He had a feeling he had arrived at his destination after a long search across the West. Morning arrived. Garrett was laid on the bed, having fallen into a deep sleep quite quickly the night before. The dim light of a lamp casting soft shadows on the walls, and the rhythmic ticking of the clock had lulled him into a much-needed repose. He slept well past sunrise. In the last hours of slumber, his thoughts were a tangled web of the abandoned mine, the absence of townsfolk in the evening, and the ever-present sense of danger that he sensed. The click of the door being unlocked and the soft squeak of the door hinges broke the silence. Garrett's eyes snapped open, his hand automatically reaching for the revolver on the bedside table. In a fluid motion, he aimed the gun at the intruder, a pretty young woman, no older than her late teens, who stood frozen in the doorway, a cleaning rag in hand. "Who are you?" Garrett demanded, his voice low and tense. The girl's eyes widened in shock, but she tried to compose herself.
"I'm Mary. I work here. I'm just here to clean the room. I didn't know you'd taken this room. I'd assumed you were in room 1.
Garrett's gaze remained steady, the gun unwavering. He swung his legs off the bed and moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. He scrutinized her carefully, searching for any sign of deceit. Mary stood perfectly still, her hands raised slightly to show she meant no harm. "Smile," he ordered.
"What?"
Mary was confused by the order. Garrett repeated, "Smile," indicating with the gun in front of her mouth. Hesitantly, she obliged, eyes flitting back and forth nervously. "Wider." Garrett was interested in her teeth. Satisfied with what he saw, he lowered his gun and slid it back into its holster. "All right," he said, his tone softening slightly. "Just doing your job, huh?" Mary nodded, a small sigh of relief escaping her lips.
Yes, sir. My duties are to service the rooms and make sure everything's clean and tidy.
"The guy who signed me in, is that your father?"
I'm not related to the manager, Mr. Jakeman. No, sir.
Garrett leaned against the wall, watching as Mary moved about the room, her initial shock giving way to the practiced efficiency of her work. She moved with a quiet grace, tidying the sparse furnishings and wiping down surfaces with a careful touch. "Didn't mean to scare you," Garrett said after a moment, his voice softer now. "I'm just cautious, that's all." Mary offered him a small smile.
I understand, Mr. Garrett. This town can make anyone a bit jumpy.
Garrett raised an eyebrow. "You know who I am?" Mary nodded, her green eyes meeting his.
Word travels fast in a place like this. Everyone knows who you are.
He sighed, the weight of his reputation settling on his shoulders. "And what do they say?" Mary shrugged lightly.
Depends on who you ask. Some see you as a hero, others, not so much. But I don't judge people based on hearsay.
Garrett appreciated her candor. "Smart girl," he muttered. As she finished her task and prepared to leave, Mary paused at the door.
If you need anything, just let me know. And, Mr. Garrett, be careful. This town has its share of secrets.
Jakeman said last night he could rustle up some food. Can you do that?
Sure. Ham and eggs okay? Coffee?
With that offer made, Garrett having nodded his acceptance, she slipped out of the room. He stared at the closed door, her words going round in his mind. The young maid had a point. There were secrets buried here, and he was determined to uncover them. Garrett hadn't done much that day. After the breakfast provided by Mary, he'd checked on Buck in the stable, walked the town to familiarize himself, then returned to take a long nap in expectation of a long night. He needed to recharge his energy. Many nights on the road, camping out, had worn him down below his preferred level of fitness and suppleness for what might be his task ahead. The short, late autumn day passed. Outside, the light was failing as day moved into night. In synchronization with the sun vanishing, the few people who had been out disappeared into their properties, doors and windows being firmly closed once inside. The night air was crisp as Garrett stepped out onto the street. The town lay under a blanket of quiet, the only sounds those of his boots on the wooden planks of the sidewalk. Not even the barking of dogs. He adjusted his hat and decided to walk towards a timber-built building down the street, the only one with lights still on. The amber glow spilling from its windows was a single beacon in the darkness. It was the only building showing some signs of activity. As he walked, he couldn't help but notice the furtive glances from behind closed windows of dwellings and businesses. Nervous faces of residents glimpsed as they drew curtains shut as he passed, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The saloon, for that was what it was a sparse, rough-hewn place, a bar made of boards laid across barrels and a chest, shelves behind, a few rickety tables and chairs scattered about. 3 customers huddled around a table, their faces weathered and hardened by years of living on the edge, played cards under the light of a kerosene lamp. In the corner, a pianist plinked out a mournful tune on an upright piano, its keys yellowed with age. A saloon girl, past her prime, blousy, rested at the bar, her eyes half closed, lost in her thoughts. Behind the bar stood Moke, the owner, a burly, mustachioed man with a permanent scowl etched on his face. As Garrett pushed open the batwing doors, the room fell silent. Moke's hand instinctively reached under the bar for the shotgun he kept there, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. The pianist's hands hovered over the keys, and the card players paused mid-game, their gazes shifting towards the newcomer. Garrett stood in the doorway, his eyes sweeping the room with practiced ease. He took in the faces, the subtle shifts in posture, the tension hanging in the air. Then, with deliberate slowness, he walked to the bar, reached into his pocket and slapped a few coins down on the worn wood. The saloon girl straightened up, a hopeful glint in her eyes as she approached Garrett, her movements languid and enticing. But he was in no mood for company. "Whiskey," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. Moke, still wary, reached for a bottle and a glass, poured a generous measure. With a nod, he signaled to the pianist to resume his melancholic tune. The card players, sensing no immediate danger, returned to their game, though their eyes flicked to Garrett every now and then. Moke glanced around the room, then addressed the card players.
"Any of you guys going to close the doors?"
His words carried a hidden meaning. One of the players, a grizzled man with a scar running down his cheek, threw in his hand and stood up. He walked to the doors, pulling them together to hide the batwing shutters and lock them, securing the bar against any unwelcome visitors. In this town, shut the door was understood to mean securing against threats. The windows got the same treatment, interior shutters sealing the place.
"Mister, we are locked in for the night."
"Suits me," said Garrett. The saloon girl sidled up to him, trying again, her hand lightly brushing his arm in a feeble attempt to gain his attention. Garrett ignored her, his focus on the glass of whiskey in front of him. Disheartened, she retreated to the end of the bar, her expression unreadable. Garrett downed his drink in one smooth motion, savoring the burn as it went down. Moke, his suspicions slightly eased, lifted the bottle and raised an eyebrow, offering to pour another. Garrett nodded, and Moke refilled the glass. The atmosphere in the saloon slowly returned to its previous state. The piano's mournful tune and the murmur of the card players' conversation created a background hum, but the tension in the room was still palpable. As he sipped his second drink, Garrett's mind wandered back to the old silver mine and the secrets it held. He knew he had to tread carefully in this town, where everyone seemed to have something to hide. The night had a long way to go, and Garrett was just getting started. This might be the place he could learn things. Moke spoke, disturbing his thoughts.
"Play poker. We got an all-nighter going."
Things were happening elsewhere as Garrett took a chair at the poker table and was dealt a hand. In the livery stable, a single lantern on the table, wick turned low, provided some illumination. The youth was not on his straw bed but was hunkered down in a corner. As a shadow fell across him, he looked up, closed his eyes, and tilted his head unwillingly to offer his neck. Meanwhile, back at the hotel, Mary moved with quiet efficiency, having decided to stay in the third bedroom rather than the bed in the kitchen, feeling safer a floor higher. She locked her bedroom door with a steady hand, then placed a wooden chair under the handle, wedging it firmly to ensure no one could force their way in. Her room was a sanctuary, but she knew better than to rely solely on the flimsy lock. She crossed the room to the window, her footsteps silent on the worn carpet over the floorboards. Pausing before drawing the curtains, she peered out into the dark street. At first, there was nothing, just the inky blackness of night pierced by the moon and the faint outlines of buildings. But then she saw it, shadows shifting, figures moving stealthily through the gloom. Mary's heart raced, and she pulled back from the window, swiftly drawing the heavy curtains closed. The darkness in her room felt safer, more protective than the uncertain night outside. She chose a single candle for illumination, over the brighter oil lantern, to avoid total blackness. She went to sit on her bed, her nerves taut like a bowstring. Reaching under her pillow, she pulled out a kitchen knife, the steel blade a comforting weight in her hand. She held it ready, her knuckles white with tension. The events of the day had unsettled her. Garrett was the first stranger in town for some time, and she had listened to Jakeman as he told her who the visitor was. She prayed his arrival was a good sign. A noise outside her room made her stiffen. It was just a creak, the old building settling, but in the silence, it sounded like a thunderclap. Mary tightened her grip on the knife, her eyes fixed on the door. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity. She listened intently, every fiber of her being focused on detecting any sound, any hint of danger. The quiet pressed in on her, thick and suffocating. But there was another noise, a scratching at her window. Slight at first, slowly intensifying. Something persistent, wanting access. Mary pressed her fist against her mouth, lest her whimpers be heard. Downstairs, in the back office that doubled as his living quarters, Jakeman sat in a rocking chair that groaned with each movement. The light from one oil lamp, set centrally, cast flickering shapes on the walls, adding to the sinister atmosphere. His pistol rested on his lap, fingers wrapped tightly around the grip. The events of the last evening had left him on edge, and he found little comfort in the weapon's weight. He knew Garrett had not returned to his room, and wondered where the man was. The silence was shattered by the sound of breaking glass from above. Jakeman's heart leapt into his throat, and he froze, his breath catching in his chest. Footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, resonating through the building. Each step seemed to reverberate through his very bones, amplifying his fear. Too frightened to move, Jakeman tightened his grip on the pistol. The footsteps continued. He could trace their journey, as if he had the ability to look through the ceiling and see the corridor above. He strained to hear, his senses heightened by the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy, smothering weight that pressed down on him. Jakeman's mind raced, imagining all manner of horrors lurking just beyond his door. Upstairs in the candle-lit room, Mary stood by the window, her breath shallow and her heart pounding in her chest. The scratching had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. She clutched the kitchen knife tightly with both hands, hands that were shaking. She'd heard glass breaking elsewhere. The sudden, slow turning of the door handle sent a chill down her spine. Someone was testing the door, probing for weakness. Mary watched in horror, her eyes wide as she held her breath. She knew the lock and chair were her only barriers against whoever, or whatever, was on the other side. Would they be enough? For a moment the handle continued to turn, a sickening reminder of her vulnerability. Then, just as abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was threatening. Mary strained to hear, her entire body tense. Footsteps, soft, retreating, moving away from her door. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Mary let out a long, pent-up breath, her shoulders sagging with the release of tension. She sank down onto the bed, the knife still clutched in her hands. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Someone had been at her door trying to get in. But why? And who? The questions swirled in her head, but she had no answers. Only fear. Mary knew she couldn't let her guard down. The night was far from over, and the danger was still present. She needed to stay vigilant, to be ready for whatever might come next. The knife was a small comfort, but it was better than nothing. She crossed herself again, whispering a silent prayer for protection. The room around her seemed to close in, the gloom deepening as the night wore on. Outside, the town was still, the quiet punctuated by the occasional distant anonymous sound. As she sat on the bed, her thoughts drifted to Pat Garrett. She wondered if he was facing the same unease, the same sense of impending danger. She hoped he was safe, that he would uncover whatever secrets the town was hiding. But for now, all Mary could do was wait. Wait and listen. The night held many secrets, and she was determined to survive until the morning light could chase them away. The following morning, as the sun crested the horizon, casting a golden hue over the small mining town, a few residents emerged from their homes, going about their morning routines with an air of subdued caution. The doors of the saloon opened, and Pat Garrett stepped out, his eyes scanning the scene before him. The activities around him were muted, the few townsfolk moving with an unspoken wariness. Garrett took note of their cautious glances and hushed conversations, his instincts telling him that events had left an imprint on their collective psyche. He walked purposefully down the dusty street towards the livery stable. Inside, the lantern had burned out, leaving the interior bathed in the soft light of dawn through the open doorway. The pale youth was hunkered down in a corner, seemingly asleep, his complexion now an unsettling deathly gray. Garrett approached, his footsteps muffled on the hay-strewn floor. He crouched beside the youth, studying him for a few seconds. The boy's breathing was shallow, his skin cold to the touch. It was clear something unnatural had transpired during the night. He pulled him over to a bed made on hay, flattened with a blanket, which appeared to be where the lad would usually sleep. Having thrown another horse blanket over the youth, without a word, Garrett stood and set about saddling his horse. His movements were methodical, each action performed with the precision of a man used to dealing with dire situations. He finished the task, mounted up, and guided his horse out of the stable. As he rode down the street, his gaze swept over the town. On the sidewalk outside the saloon, Moke stood watching, his expression thoughtful while he smoked a cigar. The burly man's eyes tracked Garrett's progress, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. Nothing other than poker had been the conversation through the night. The saloon owner sizing up the visitor, the customers wary of his reputation, and Garrett not offering any information. Spotting Moke, Garrett tapped the brim of his hat in silent acknowledgement and urged his horse into a steady trot. He rode past the scattered buildings, the morning light low in the sky. As the town receded behind him, he was soon at the circus wagons. He slowed to look them over without going near, now wondering about their stillness in the morning, when he would have expected smoke from breakfast's cooking. Had their occupants disappeared like the miners? Reaching the abandoned mine, the stillness here too was almost physical. No sign of activity, no sounds of work, just a deserted, forgotten place. A shabby rag of a curtain fluttered in and out of the glassless window of the shack like a ghostly sentinel guarding its secrets. Garrett approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of life or danger, for any change since his first inspection. He eased into the yard, dismounted, and tied his horse to a trough. The horse, sensing the unease, pawed the ground and snickered nervously. Garrett whispered soothing words and caressed its muzzle, calming the animal with his touch. Satisfied, he turned his attention to the mine entrance, the place he had come to investigate. The entrance loomed before him, dark and foreboding. He stepped inside, the air cool and damp. His eyes quickly adjusted to the change in light. Just inside the entrance, a couple of lanterns and a few scattered tools caught his attention. He picked up one of the lanterns, giving it a careful shake. The sound of fuel sloshing inside reassured him. He struck a match, lit the wick, and held the lantern high to cast its light into the depths of the mine. Pulling the map from his pocket, he consulted it. 100 feet in, following a small downward incline, the tunnel opened into a more cavernous space. The walls, illuminated by the lantern's glow, sparkled with specks of silver. Garrett marveled at the sight. The mine had not been depleted, far from it. The walls still held wealth, untouched and unmined. The main working area was littered with more abandoned lanterns and pickaxes, relics of the miners who had once toiled here. Garrett's mind raced with possibilities. What could have caused a working mine, still rich with silver, to be abandoned so suddenly? Where had the crew disappeared to? He walked deeper into the cavern, the light from his lantern casting his distorted resemblance on the walls as he swung it back and forth in examination of his surroundings. The silence hung heavy, broken only by the occasional drip of water from some unseen crevice. Garrett's footsteps rang, a lonely sound in the vast emptiness. The tunnel extended beyond the working cavern. Smooth walls indicated that once an underground river had flowed here, and the larger cavern may once have been an underground lake. There did not appear to be any mine workings further on. The cavern had been providing the main source of silver. As he explored, he found more signs of a hasty departure. Tools left where they had been dropped, a lunch pail still half full, its contents now moldy, a jacket slung over a crate. It was as if the miners had vanished into thin air, leaving their belongings behind. Garrett's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The mine was more than just a source of silver. It was a mystery waiting to be unraveled. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, a sense of foreboding that something was not right. He moved cautiously, aware that he could not be alone in his curiosity about the mine. The events of the previous night and the strange occurrences all pointed to something darker at play. Somewhere there would be players with a stake in the mine, or opportunists to take advantage of the abandonment. With a resolve to uncover the truth, Garrett returned to the yard. The secrets of the old silver mine would not remain buried forever. He would see to that. Exiting the mine, the daylight momentarily blinded him. As his vision adjusted, he pulled up sharply, his instincts kicking in. In one swift motion, he fast drew his gun, ready for whatever threat awaited. 3 men stood a few paces away, Mayor Anderson, Moak, and Jakeman. They raised their hands in surrender, fear and determination showing on their faces. Anderson spoke first, his voice trembling slightly.
Easy, mister. We mean no harm.
Garrett kept his gun trained on them, his eyes cold and unyielding. Anderson swallowed hard and continued.
Pat Garrick?
Garrett's eyes narrowed. What of it? Anderson seemed to draw some confidence from Garrett's acknowledgement.
We'd like to offer you a job.
Not interested, Garrett growled, his voice like gravel. Jakeman, desperate, jumped in.
But you haven't heard our offer.
Garrett remained unmoved, still not interested. Moak stepped forward, trying to placate.
Don't be so quick. Costs nothing to listen. We're prepared to be generous.
The 3 men exchanged nervous glances, seeking strength in their shared predicament before the former lawman. Garrett's stance softened a fraction. All right, start talking. Anderson pointed towards the awning.
Let's move over there into the shade.
They walked to the work area used for maintaining pit equipment. Garrett moved a hand axe on the ground nearer to a whetstone wheel so it was within reach before sitting down. Moke produced a quart of whiskey from an inside coat pocket and held it up, giving an order to Jakeman.
See if you can find some cups in the hut.
Jakeman, who had just squatted down, jumped up and hurried into the hut. Moments later, he emerged with 4 mugs and returned to the group. Anderson seemed more at ease now, ready to share his concerns over a drink. He took the bottle from Moke and poured generously into the mugs, saying as he poured,
Mr. Garrett, this town is in trouble. We don't have a marshal, and no men of note to be one.
Garrett's silence encouraged him to continue.
A week ago, a circus arrived in town. We woke up one morning, and there it was. Nobody around, just the wagons parked on the edge of town.
Jakeman interjected.
We never saw a soul, at least not until the evening after sunset.
Moke had something to add.
They put on quite a show. 4 men and 2 women. Not quite sure what we watched, but it was amazing. The men picked up the women, held them high with one hand, juggled with them. Can you believe that? Throwing them to each other.
Jakeman's look was far away, in the past.
Then they walked through fire, never burned, let alone scorched.
Anderson shook his head in wonder.
Never seen anything like it. Then the next day, the manager from the mine came into town, looking for some of his men. They hadn't turned up for work. We assumed they'd got drunk and passed out somewhere. Organized a search party, but found nothing. We went to the circus, but no one was around. The wagons were all closed up, the men and women nowhere to be seen.
As the mayor paused, Moke filled the silence.
The next evening, the circus was running again. Most of the town went back. Those who had seen it the first night wanted to see it again. Those who had missed it came because they had heard of the wonders.
Next day, no more miners. All gone. Not a sign.
Anderson shook his head. Garrett was curious as to what the men thought. What do you think happened? Anderson let out a big sigh.
God knows. For the miners to disappear into thin air like that. Some thought there had been a cave-in, the miners buried. But we checked, and there's nothing to indicate a fall.
What do you want me to do?
Investigate. Without that mine working, the town will die.
Garrett looked from Anderson to Moke to Jakeman and back again. What aren't you telling me? The men exchanged uneasy glances, but eventually Anderson spoke up.
We've been losing people every night, and the town's afraid.
Garrett pondered his response, then stood up, leaving the 3 men bewildered. He walked towards his horse, his mind racing.
What? What is it?
Garrett turned to face them. Leave town. Everybody, get out. He turned and walked to his horse, his mind already turning over the possibilities. The mine held more than just silver. It held secrets. And Garrett was determined to uncover them. Now he had further information about the recent events. It was all coming together. His mission might be nearing its conclusion. As he mounted his horse and rode back towards town, he could feel the eyes of the 3 men on his back. They had their own fears and motivations, but Garrett had his own code to follow. The truth would come to light one way or another. In town, Mary lay on her bed, having finally succumbed to exhaustion in the early hours after midnight. She woke with a start, her hands fumbling for the knife. But then she noticed the light seeping through the curtains. Letting out a sigh of relief, she realized she had made it through the night. With a determined look, she took up the knife, removed the chair from under the door handle, and unlocked the door. Opening it, she cautiously stuck her head out into the corridor. Seeing no immediate danger, she stepped out with quiet stealth, making her way towards Garrett's room. She paused briefly, listening for any sounds, and then slowly opened the door to his room. Inside, everything was undisturbed, just as it had been the previous night. Satisfied but still on edge, she closed the door quietly and continued towards the first bedroom. She hesitated, her heart pounding, then opened the door. She jumped, startled as a cat darted out, screeching. Inside the room, she saw the broken window, the point of entry for whoever, or whatever, had invaded the boarding house during the night. Garrett rode up the dusty street, his eyes keenly observing his surroundings, seeing them differently in the light of his new knowledge. The sound of hammering caught his attention, and he looked up at the second floor of the boarding house. There, Mary was nailing boards across the window of the first bedroom. She was focused on her task and did not realize she was being watched by Garrett. He allowed himself a brief moment of contemplation before turning his horse towards the stable. Having followed Garrett, the trio arrived at the saloon, their faces lined with weariness and uncertainty. A nervous Jakeman spoke first.
Should we be leaving?
Mo considered his options.
This saloon is all I've got. I can't start up again somewhere else.
The mayor had his interests too.
Besides, the mine hasn't run dry. Surely we can get it going. All that wealth sitting there.
Jakeman was unconvinced.
But you heard what Garrett said. Get out of town now or die.
Silence fell over the room as the men pondered their predicament. The door swung open, and Garrett stepped in, his presence commanding immediate attention. He looked at the three men, his expression unreadable. "I need silver, a bullet press, and a smelter." In the back room of the saloon, Moke had busied himself supplying Garrett with the necessary equipment. A tabletop smelter glowed warmly as it melted silver dollars. Garrett worked methodically, pulling the lead out of his bullets with a pair of pliers and preparing the casings for new silver bullets. Moke checked the smelter's progress, the molten silver's progress from solid to liquid.
Nearly ready,
he reported. Garrett nodded, his focus unwavering. When the silver was sufficiently melted, Moke gave a nod of confirmation. Garrett carefully took the ladle and poured the molten silver into a bullet mold, crafting the new ammunition with meticulous care. As he worked, the room filled with a sense of purpose and urgency. The silver bullets were more than just ammunition. They were a symbol of the fight ahead, a necessary tool to combat the unknown threats lurking in the darkness. The evening came. From the setting sun, shadows grew across the street and touched the livery stable like giant fingers grasping the building. As the daylight faded, a sense of foreboding hung over the town. Again, doors were closed and secured, curtains drawn, and the town went into hibernation. Inside the stable, the youth lay on the makeshift bed of hay, his eyes flickering weakly, barely clinging to life. He'd regained consciousness in the day, tried to work but only had the strength to pull himself to the haybed as night had fallen. Now a shadow fell over him, and with great effort he raised his head, offering his neck. Buck snickered and stamped in his stall. A female leaned over the lad, her lips curling back to reveal sharp fangs ready to feast. But before she could sink her teeth into his neck, she was violently pulled back. Angry and snarling, she turned to face her assailant. It was Garrett, who had been waiting in Buck's stall. He'd noticed the puncture wounds that morning and had understood what they were. He'd returned to wait, checked on the youth, and lit a lantern. The lawman and the vampire, for that was what she was, circled each other warily. Her strength, though diminished from lack of feeding since the previous night, was still superior to Garrett's. She toyed with him. The fight was uneven, and it seemed Garrett might lose. She'd blocked his punches, moved effortlessly to avoid being tackled, and was savoring the contest, anticipating another victim. A moan from the youth behind her distracted the vampire momentarily. She looked back to check for another attacker, fearing she'd been tricked. Seizing the opportunity, Garrett grabbed a nearby broom and snapped the handle in two. As she turned back towards him, he drove the jagged end into her chest, piercing her heart and pinning her up against the wall as he kept his weight behind the broken broom handle. The vampire trembled violently before going still. When Garrett released his grip on the broom handle, she crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Jakeman and Mary were securing the hotel, closing shutters on the windows, when the door burst open. Garrett entered, carrying the pale youth in his arms. Jakeman hurriedly closed and secured the door behind them. "See to him," Garrett ordered as he moved through to Jakeman's room at the back, carefully laying the boy on a cot. Mary followed him, her face drawn with concern. She knelt beside the boy, her hands gentle as she assessed his condition.
What has happened to him?
Garrett said, with meaning, "An evil, the evil that infects this town." Mary's eyes widened, her fear evident. Garrett's words hung heavily in the air, a grim reminder of the darkness they were up against. Garrett stood watch, his mind already planning the next move. The threat was far from over, but with silver bullets and newfound resolve, he was determined to cleanse the town of its evil. His quest had reached its destination. Darkness had enveloped the small town, the moon and stars casting their meager glow. Now the only building with a light was the stable, where Garrett had left the lantern on when he carried the youth out minutes earlier. There was no one to see a dark figure slipping into the stable from the street. In the hotel, Garrett positioned a chair facing the door and sat with his rifle at hand. Beyond him, through the open internal door, Mary tended to the frail teenager, while Jakeman fretted nervously nearby. The silence was immediately broken by a blood-curdling howl from the stable. As the howl faded, movement stirred at the mouth of the mine. Stumbling figures emerged into the moonlight, the miners, caught in an in-between state, neither fully alive nor dead, their blood drained to feed the vampires. They shuffled towards the town, a macabre procession. Garrett had risen from his chair to peek out the window to determine the source of the howl. Mary and Jakeman stood in the internal doorway, their eyes on him, wondering what the sound signified. They were oblivious to the pale youth rising behind them. Garrett turned just in time. "Look out!" The youth, now transformed into one of the undead, lunged at Mary. Jakeman stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Garrett sprang forward, striking the lad with the butt of his rifle, knocking him into the back room. Mary slumped to the floor, nearly fainting from shock. The pale youth lay on the floor of the back room, trying to rise. Garrett rushed in, tossed his rifle onto the cot, and grabbed a chair. He rammed it down onto the youth, piercing his heart with one of the legs, the crack of breaking breastbone and a forced exhalation of breath. The youth shuddered, then lay still, the unnatural life finally leaving him. Garrett, panting from the effort, retrieved his rifle and returned to the reception area. Jakeman remained frozen with shock, while Mary lay slumped. Garrett knelt beside her, deeply concerned, and checked her for wounds. He was relieved to find none. "Give her brandy or whiskey." Jakeman, shaken from his inaction by the force of Garrett's voice, hurried behind the counter to find a bottle. Garrett checked his rifle ammo, the light glinting off the silver bullets in his gun belt. "Lock the door after me," he said before he unbolted the door and exited. Jakeman rushed to secure it behind him. The moonlight cast a surreal silver glow over the small western town as the undead miners shuffled up the street. Garrett stepped off the boardwalk and walked purposefully down the middle of the street, drawing the attention of the mindless horde. The miners, sensing a living target, began to converge on him. Garrett raised his rifle and fired repeatedly, hitting his marks. Each shot caused the miners to pause, but it did not immediately stop them. They continued to advance, closer and closer, as his rifle emptied. Having achieved the purpose of breaking up the group into individuals, Garrett let it drop to the ground and drew his pistol. He walked up to each miner in turn, aiming carefully and firing into their heads. The shots blew out matter, dropping each one in succession. Quickly reloading, he continued his task. The street was soon littered with their corpses. Garrett stood among the fallen, his breath heavy with exertion. Down the street a figure emerged from the stable, a man tall and imposing, carrying the lifeless female vampire. This was Magre, the chief vampire. He stared at Garrett, the two recognizing each other as adversaries. The impasse was brief. Magre turned and, with effortless grace, carried the female in the opposite direction, retreating towards the circus wagons. Garrett wearily relaxed, grateful not to have to continue the fight for now, his stamina nearly spent. Jakeman was administering brandy to Mary, who choked as a large mouthful went down. A heavy pounding on the door broke the moment. "It's me. Open up." And they recognized Garrett's voice. Jakeman quickly undid the bolts and let Garrett in. Garrett took the brandy bottle from him and drank deeply while Jakeman secured the door again. Mary had recovered somewhat and looked up at Garrett, who asked, "You okay?" Mary had questions.
What just happened?
"Your town has been taken over by vampires. They've been traveling around as a circus, visiting small remote communities, living off the locals, then moving on when the town is done for.
Why us?
You fit their needs."
Where did they come from?
Jakeman was out of his depth. Garrett enlightened them both. Europe, last century. They stayed in New York until they drew too much attention, then they started traveling.
How do you know all this?
Heard rumors. Then I found a town where they had been. A couple of survivors. Told me what had happened. I've been trailing them. The circus was a cover to attract people. I hadn't realized until I got here how they did it.
What can we do?
Jakeman was sorely afraid. Garrett considered the question, his face grim. The fight was far from over, and the town's survival depended on their actions. We need to hit them at their lair, destroy them at their base, while they are all together. It won't be easy, but it's the only way. Mary and Jakeman exchanged worried glances. The task ahead was daunting, but they had no choice. The town's fate hung in the balance, and they had to fight for their survival. Further down the street, the tension in the saloon was tangible. Moke, Anderson, the saloon girl, the customers, and the pianist were all on edge, having heard the eerie howl and the gunfire. Anderson paced in a small area, back and forth.
What do you think is happening?
Moke, who had been peering through the shutters, secured them before turning to the men.
Not sure. Looked like the miners going up the street, but strangely, very strangely.
Anderson paused his pacing.
Who did the shooting?
The saloon owner replied.
Couldn't see. Came from up the street. Might be Garrett. He's staying at Jakeman's.
Moke turned to the pianist, his frustration evident.
Hey, play something, goddammit.
The pianist hit the keys, but his hands shook too much to make coherent music.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
The pianist stopped, and the room fell into a tense silence. The customers half-heartedly played poker, their eyes more on Moke and Anderson than their cards, seeking direction. Abruptly, the door rattled. The men held their breath, focusing on the door. The rattling stopped, and they exhaled in relief. Too soon. The door crashed open, followed by a burst of flames as burning torches were thrown in. 4 male vampires, Magri and 3 others, and Agnosta, the surviving female vampire, stormed in. Bloody mayhem erupted as the vampires sought vengeance, no longer interested in working the town as a farm. They were determined to wipe out the humans before moving on to the next community, gorge on blood and take prisoners to feed them while traveling to a new destination. The men tried to flee, but the vampires hunted them down inside the saloon. 3 vampires took out the poker players and the pianist, who had been transfixed with terror. Each one met a gruesome end, with the saloon girl being the last to die by the bite of Agnosta. Magre had grabbed Moke before he could reach his shotgun, pinning him to the bar. The saloon owner was helpless as Magre leaned in and bit his throat, not to drink blood but to rip it out. The saloon owner's corpse crashed to the floor as Magre spat the flesh of the throat out. The male vampires let out a chorus of howls like an ungodly wolf pack. Hiding behind the piano, Anderson hoped to wait it out until the vampires left. He thought he was unnoticed until the piano flew away, thrown by Agnosta. She looked at her whimpering victim with delight. Jakeman carefully looked out the window, desperate to know what the noises indicated. Mary stood against the back wall, away from the doors. Garrett sat, cleaning his rifle, making sure no dirt from the street would prevent it working properly, his mind occupied by the task. Jakeman turned away from the window.
The saloon's on fire. We should go help.
Unemotionally, Garrett spoke. They're dead.
How do you know?
Garrett looked up from his task. Do you hear any shooting? Jakeman shook his head. They're dead. Garrett loaded his rifle with silver bullets. A frightened Mary asked,
What are we going to do? Will we be next?
Maybe. Or they may be sated now and leave us for tomorrow night.
I won't be here tomorrow night. I'm getting out. I'll see who else wants to leave.
The hotel owner had decided it was a fight they couldn't win. They may follow you now. We poked the bear by destroying one of them and their slaves. They won't want anyone alive to tell the tale of them, except for those they take along for food. Mary shuddered.
Food?
They'll need nourishment until they find their next town. They'll keep some people for blood like we'd keep cows for milk. Mary's face twisted in horror at the thought. You want to rest? I'll stay on guard. Jakeman, I'll wake you to take over later. The 4 male vampires and Agnosta walked away from the town, the burning saloon, and the risen full moon lighting their path. Agnosta led Anderson on a leash, his face a mask of fear and resignation. At their base, she tied him to a wagon wheel, ensuring he couldn't escape. The 3 male vampires moved towards one of the wagons, where the dead female vampire lay in a coffin nearby. They began a solemn vigil, their eyes never leaving her still form. They would protect her until dawn, when they would hide away from the sunlight that would finally destroy her remains. Magre waited for Agnosta, and together they entered the main wagon. Before stepping inside, Magre looked back towards the town, his lips pulling back in a hiss of anger and defiance. The town couldn't be seen, but its location was shown by the smoke rising from the saloon and the glow of flames underlighting it. Inside their wagon, 2 open coffins served as beds for the vampire couple. Magre and Agnosta shared a moment of intimacy, holding and caressing each other. Their bond was strong, perhaps even predating their transformation into vampires. It was a moment of comfort and connection in the midst of their ungodly existence. Next morning, the sun rose over the quiet town, casting light on the smoking ruins of the saloon. The streets were empty, the silence a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. No citizen was venturing out. Mary was on watch, her eyes scanning the street through a crack in the shutters. Jakeman slept fitfully in his cot in the back room, the body of the youth having been removed. Garrett appeared to be sleeping in his chair, but he was awake, his mind racing with thoughts of the night ahead. She turned and saw that Garrett was awake.
Coffee?
Garrett nodded. Mary went into the back room to make a pot, and Jakeman stirred, yawning as he woke. In the reception area, the lawman stood, stretched, and walked over to the window to check that it was indeed morning. From the back room, Jakeman joined him, rubbing the sleep from his eyes.
We got through the night then.
They'll come tonight.
I'm leaving. I'm not staying here to die. I'll take my chances on the road.
Garrett unlocked the door and opened it, breathing in the fresh morning air. Or you can stay and finish them off.
But you killed them. They took the guys in the saloon out.
Stake through the heart. Jakeman looked uncertain, but Garrett's resolve was unwavering. The fight was far from over, and they had to be prepared for the next assault. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, indicating the passage of time. The streets remained deserted, the townspeople too frightened to leave their homes, only the bodies of the miners littering the way. No sign of the body of the stable lad, just dust and bones in his clothes, flesh disintegrated in the sun's rays. The saloon ruins was still sending up whispers of smoke, and no one went to investigate. The building was gutted, just walls surviving but likely to collapse. Garrett emerged from the livery stable, leading Buck. Mounting, he directed it towards the mine. Daylight was on his side, but the clock was ticking in the short autumn day. As he rode past the circus encampment, the scene was eerily quiet. An empty coffin, scattered clothes, ashes, and a broken broom handle marked the spot where the female vampire had met her end in the sun's light. Garrett continued towards the mine, undeterred. Approaching the mine, Garrett rode past the sign that read "No trespassers. Keep out or get shot," thinking it ironic with what had passed. He dismounted by the water trough, secured his horse, and let it drink. Spotting the hand axe and sharpening wheel he had noticed earlier, he picked up the axe and tested the blade. Finding it dull, he used the foot-operated sharpener to hone it to a keen edge. Satisfied with his work, Garrett moved to the hut. Inside, he picked up a chair and slammed it down, breaking it into usable pieces. Selecting those that could serve as stakes, he pulled down the curtain and took everything outside. Using the axe, he sharpened one end of each stake. When he felt he had them as needed, he wrapped them in the old curtain, tied them to his saddle, and mounted his horse to ride back towards town in the circus wagons. Carefully, he approached the encampment, dismounted, and carried the bundle of stakes towards the main wagon. He saw Anderson, unconscious, tied to a wheel, but ignored him and attempted to open the door. It was strong and unyielding. Inside, Magre and Agnosta lay in their coffins. At the sound of the attempted break-in, Magre's eyes snapped open. Rising from his coffin, he moved towards the door. On the other side, Garrett gave up and moved away, which allowed a thin sliver of sunlight to filter under the door to touch Magre's boots. The vampire hissed and retreated from the threat. Garrett tried the door of the other wagon but had no better success. Realizing he couldn't access the vampires during the day, he stood frustrated, looking at the wagons. A new plan began to form in his mind. He cut Anderson's bonds, then mounted his horse and returned to the mine. Anderson would have to fend for himself. Garrett had not time to divert from his mission. Arriving back, Garrett dismounted and secured his horse at the trough again. With determination, he walked into the mine and examined the items left by the miners. Taking a mental inventory of powder and lanterns, he made a plan. As the sun went to rest below the western horizon, daylight faded ominously, signaling the approach of night and darkness. Mary stood on the boardwalk, looking up and down the street. She was alone and frightened, worried that Garrett wasn't returning. Garrett stepped out of the mine, surprised by how late it had become. Hastily, he mounted his horse and rode fast back to town. He galloped past the circus wagons, unaware that inside the vampires were beginning to stir. The sun now dipped below the horizon, casting a glorious red glow across the sky that slowly transformed into twilight. The first stars appeared. The doors to the wagons opened, and Magrish stepped out, his eyes locking onto the sight of Garrett riding away at a fast pace. A hideous grin spread across his face. Agnosta joined him, while the 3 male vampires emerged from the second wagon. The unholy quintet gathered together at the coffin of their demised sister, ready to finish their grim work. In town, Garrett rode swiftly down the street. Mary emerged from the boarding house where she had gone inside to start the lockdown. Relief washed over her as she saw him approaching. "Jakeman?" Mary replied without emotion.
Gone.
Garrett made a decision. "We can't stay here. Get up behind me." Mary quickly mounted behind Garrett, holding on as he wheeled the horse and rode back the way he had come, back to the mine. The vampires were preparing to march on the town when Garrett and Mary rode past. Anderson had hidden under a wagon, too tired when Garrett cut his bonds to make an escape, but now he attempted to run. He made no yards before one of the male vampires pounced on him, biting savagely. Agnosta, furious, pulled the vampire off. Anderson was hers. Ignoring the chaos behind him, Magrish focused on Garrett's destination. He saw his adversary turn towards the mine and signaled his troop to follow. The town could wait. Arriving at the mine, Garrett dismounted quickly. "I want you to ride. Keep riding. Don't stop." Mary didn't understand.
What about you?
"The horse can't carry us both and outrun the vampires. You've got a chance alone." Garrett slapped the horse on its rump, sending it running with Mary on its back. He watched her ride away, her face a mix of fear and sadness. Turning his attention in the direction of the circus wagon encampment, Garrett saw the vampires approaching. He drew his pistol and fired in their direction, not to stop them but to draw their attention away from Mary. "Come on, you bastards! Come and get me!" Satisfied that he had their attention, Garrett turned and ran into the mine. The vampires moved swiftly, almost flying, driven by their desire for revenge against the killer of their sister. Inside the mine, Garrett lit a lantern and used the butt of his pistol to smash open a barrel of gunpowder he'd found earlier with others. He laid a trail of powder from the other barrels into the deeper interior of the mine, anxiously looking over his shoulder, trying to gauge if he had enough time, working his way to the cavern. The vampires arrived, slowly spacing themselves apart in the yard to be certain that Garrett wasn't lying in wait. One checked the shack, emerging to shake his head. Another was looking at the mine entrance. Spotting the light inside, he waved. Magrish approached and took the lead, signaled for the others to follow him in, confident they had Garrett trapped. Once he was dealt with, and their energy renewed on his blood, they could go to the town. The 5 vampires walked past the barrels of powder, deeper into the mine. Garrett's voice echoed through the tunnel. "There once was a man of conviction, who had such elegant diction. He could speak in blank verse, and to make things worse, he is entirely a work of fiction." Garrett's nonsense song ensured the vampires followed him. He'd worked the powder trail around the cavern's edges, creating paths that would converge and lead back up the main passage. Next, he lit a couple of lanterns that were already there, and positioned the lantern he had used to light his way in behind him, closer to the lower tunnel, just in time. Magrish was the first to arrive, pausing as he saw Garrett seemingly trapped. Agnosta and the 3 male vampires followed, all eyes on Garrett. Magrish made a circular motion with a hand to the males, to circle around the lawman, preventing his escape. Standing centrally, Garrett took up a pickaxe, posing as if ready to fight. Magrish grinned, and the others leered in anticipation. The chief vampire approached Garrett slowly, savoring the moment. Agnosta put her hand on his arm, stopping him, indicating she wanted Garrett for herself. Magre, finding this amusing, stepped back to let her take over. Agnosta played with Garrett, moving in and out of range of wild swings of the pickaxe. The other vampires enjoyed the spectacle. They all hoped for a share of his blood when Agnosta finished with him. A hors d'oeuvres before a feast in town. Finally, Agnosta moved in to finish Garrett, anticipating she could avoid the pickaxe and overpower him. He surprised her by dropping the tool and drawing his gun, firing into her repeatedly, fanning the hammer, the punch of the bullets knocking her down. Before she could rise, he picked up and swung the pickaxe, striking the point through her chest and into her heart. She expired with a great shriek, her skin withering and turning gray. The other vampires were horrified by the turn of events, howling in frustration and anger. Garrett smiled, pointed his gun at Magre, who was still surprised at the turn of events. The lawman pulled the trigger, click, as the hammer hit an empty cartridge. Magre laughed soundlessly, but Garrett's bigger laugh made him pause. The empty pistol was thrown at a lantern positioned over the powder trails. On contact, the lantern broke, igniting the powder trails that fizzed away up the tunnel towards the entrance. Garrett had a grim smile. "Welcome to hell." On the road away from the mine and town, Mary rode on Garrett's horse, tears streaming down her face. Behind her, an explosion rocked the mine as Garrett blew it, sealing himself and the vampires inside. The end. Read the book, available as an ebook on Amazon Kindle.
When I read the screenplay by Keith Lawson, I thought what a great story, and asked for permission to adapt as a short story. I interviewed Keith about the content and his knowledge of gothic horror. While purists might quibble about how to destroy a vampire, yes, we know that, traditionally, silver bullets are for werewolves. But it is a purer metal than lead, and there is a silver mine in the plot. We are talking about myths and not facts. And it turned out, both Keith and I are Lone Ranger aficionados. If you know, you know. While the wait for the screenplay to be commissioned and produced as a movie, the story allows early access and entertainment, available as an ebook on Amazon Kindle. All rights reserved. Only Pat Garrett is based on an historical figure. All other characters are fictitious, and any resemblance to any person living or dead is purely coincidental.